they're going to lay out, because this is not just a cursing of the darkness, but actually a resolution that says what kind of specific resolve. And then following that, I will say a word along with the Reverend Dr. Liz D. Harris about this moment we're in and why it must be now. So would you come with the Reverend John and Rob, would y'all all stand together?
Hello, everybody. I'm Shelley DeBarnes, and as the policy director of the Poor People's Campaign and a lawyer who has been working with some of the leading policy institutes, experts, and economists in the country, and having worked with, listened to, and organized alongside poor people for a number of years, I know, we know, that this resolution and the policy agenda it will inspire can both begin to meet the needs of the 140 million poor and low-income people, both the 40 million people living below the poverty line and the 100 million people living one emergency above it. This resolution can also strengthen our entire economy by restructuring it from the bottom up. Some of what is called for in this third Reconstruction resolution, as we've heard, is to update the poverty measure and get a true accounting of who is poor, to expand our social welfare programs to fully meet these needs, to enact living wages and protect the right to work, to provide universal single-payer health care for all, and guarantee that everyone has the right to housing, welfare, water, and equitable and diverse public education, to relieve debts that cannot be paid, to expand and protect voting rights and save this democracy, to ensure the rights of indigenous people and native people, and establish national commissions on truth, racial justice, and transformation, and on reparations, to enact comprehensive and just immigration reform, embrace a bold climate agenda that prioritizes the poor and those hit first and worst by climate disaster, demilitarize our foreign policy, our borders, and policing, and in fact redirect military spending, implement fair taxes, and break free from decades of trickle-down economics by being willing to spend resources on these programs of social uplift. A moral and policy and legislative agenda that takes on this vision is not only necessary for the 140 million and the right thing to do, it is also good and sound economics and necessary for the health and well-being of us all.
I ask Ross Pellis to join me here, and also I want to ask a young man to stand with me whose aunt was beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, Miss Boyington. He's a young man with working with young people that are part of the Poor People's Campaign all over the country. I want to thank Congresswoman Lee and Congresswoman Jayapal and all of these progressive and prophetic, visionary congresspersons who are clear. Sometimes you got to get some people that are clear-eyed. Clear-eyed that if this nation is serious and wants to fully address poverty and low wealth from the bottom up, we all of us first as human beings and as moral agents must embrace this an omnibus vision of third Reconstruction. We can't tinker around the edges. We can't pass a little policy here and there every 10 or 15 years. No democracy can claim to be strong when 140 million people, or 43% of its people, are poor and low wealth. And I want to say to me to get these numbers, that's talking about 52% of children under 18, 39 million children. That's 41%, Congressman Lee, of our elders above 65, 21 million. That's 42.6% of men, that's 65 million. That's 45% of women, 74 million women. That's 60% of black people, 26 million. That's 64% of Latinos, 38 million. That's 40% of Asian people, 80 million. That's 59% of Native Indigenous people, that's 2.1 million. And listen, because of how the narrative is often misspoken, that's 33.5% of white people, that's 66 million white people. 62 million people right now, and in the midst of the pandemic, make less than $17 an hour. Before the pandemic ever hit, according to a study at Columbia University, 250,000 people a year died from poverty, not the pandemic of poverty. 750 people a day. 400 people were making an average of $97,000 an hour, while 62 million people made less than $17 an hour. Prior to the pandemic, those who suffered the most during the pandemic, they suffered the most, while billionaires made nearly $2 trillion during the pandemic. 8 million more of our brothers and sisters fell into poverty. And poor and low-wage workers, the stat that we haven't talked about much during this pandemic. You hear about race, and we should, and you hear about different cities, but the poor and low-wealth people of all groups have been the ones who risked the most in this pandemic. They were the first that had to go back to work, the first to get infected, the first to get sick, the first to get hospitalized, and the first to die. They have been 3 times as likely to contract COVID as their wealthiest neighbors. And we know that if we're going to get the omnibus legislation necessary for a third reconstruction, fully addressing poverty and low wealth from the bottom up, we must address several interlocking injustices simultaneously. You can't separate them anymore. Systemic racism as it relates to all of racism, against black people, brown people, indigenous people, Asian people, and the collateral damage done to white people because of systemic racism. Systemic poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, and militarization of our community, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. We know that the cost of not addressing inequality is too high. This is the question we ask the media to ask, because we already know what the criticism will be. Well, how much does it cost? But Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel Peace Prize economist, said for us, this is the real question. What is the cost of inequality? What is the cost of leaving it as it is? This is a moral issue rooted in the commitments of our Constitution, that the first thing we swear to is to establish justice, promote the general welfare, and to ensure equal protection under the law. This is a moral agenda, but a moral agenda from my faith tradition, this is Pentecost week for me as a Christian. And in Pentecost, morality is not just folk coming together and singing we love each other. It is coming together by the Spirit, building a community where there is no lack. So a moral agenda is also a sound economic agenda. We must preach good news to the poor, those who've been made poor because of economic injustice, not because of their personal morality. We must stop the policies that one scripture says robs the poor of their rights. Robs the poor of their rights. We must change how we measure poverty. We must have living wages. We must have an infrastructure bill that builds from the bottom up. We must have, how is it that we can come through a pandemic, a health crisis, and not have as a centerpiece of our agenda health care for everybody that's not connected to their job, but connected to their humanity? We know the stories, and I close here with the stories. We couldn't bring them here because of the pandemic. Some people didn't want to get on the plane. But I stand here today, and I'm bringing to you in my spirit the story of Callie Greer from Selma, Alabama, a leader with the Alabama Poor People's Campaign who lost her son to gun violence, and her daughter died with her looking at her because Alabama didn't expand Medicaid. And she has vowed that she cannot waste those tears. She cannot waste that experience. She says Venus was not called home by God. Venus was killed by a society that denied her medical care. And 3 years ago, right in front of this building, she called on lawmakers to summon the resolve. That's who's behind the agenda of this resolution. I bring to you Sarah Farrington from North Carolina, a Fight for 15 worker, works for less than a living wage. She's a leader, has been a waitress at Waffle House, earning a minimum wage of, guess what, $2.13 an hour. And those were the people who got hurt first in this pandemic. And they only make $2.13 an hour plus tips. A policy of tipping that grows out of post-slavery era in this country. She had struggled for years to make ends meet. She told us how one time she was believing the distortions of religious nationalism and even white supremacy. But at the age of 44, she voted for the first time in her life. She said, I voted because I voted for the candidates I heard campaigning on raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, and we're talking about defending workers, dealing with racism, and building from the bottom up. And then lastly, I want to bring to you, and these are three women. One is black, one is white, and then I want to bring for you one more lady, Mary Jane Shanker, a Kansas farmer's wife, a registered nurse, and a proud member of the Kansas Coordinating Committee of the Poor People's Campaign. She tells us and she keeps before us the plight of poor farmers. She told us the story of farmers that are committing suicide at high rates because the debt is up to their ears. The problems they have from farm bankruptcies and the lack of health care and poverty. She said those Kansas farmers are going to organize with those Carolina Fight for 15 workers. We know what we must do. And so Congressman John Paul and Congressman Lee and all of you that are here, this is what we commit to support this agenda. We will mobilize poor and low wealth people and voters all over this land of every race, creed, color, people of faith, no faith. We know poor and low wealth people make up 30% of the electorate now, 65 million people. We know that in 15 states, 1 to 25% of poor and low wealth people that are already registered to vote, if they voted, 1 to 25% voted that didn't vote, they can determine who holds every office. Last June, we held a mass Poor People's Assembly Moral March on Washington virtually with 300 partners, 1,500 prophetic clergy council, and 2.4 million people showed up online last June and said we must demand this nation fully address poverty and low wealth. On Monday, we will have a national town hall. You will be joining us as this resolution is introduced. Next month, on June 21st, on Monday, tomorrow Monday, we will launch 365 days of mobilizing towards a mass poor people's low wage workers assembly and moral march on Washington in person for June 2022. Because we're going to put a face on poverty. And we promise you that next June 22, you will not hear about people pontificating about the poor. You will hear the poor and low wealth speaking themselves, and laying out their power and shifting the narrative. You will see that collection that we say can't come together. White folk from Appalachia and black folk from Alabama and people from California and the Carolinas. And so I close. We know what we have to do. We must have a third reconstruction to fully address poverty and low wealth from the bottom up. And to those that may criticize, we've already got 2 answers for you, so we're ready. There is no scarcity of resources. Because we've already done a budget too. We know that when we talk about deficit spending, we see it as investment, and it comes back in a big way. Secondly, there is no scarcity of solutions. What we have in this country and have had for far too long is a scarcity of moral fusion, social conscience. And it ends now with us and with this movement. And we will see the birthing of a third reconstruction. Reverend Dr. Lee, go ahead.
I'm proud to stand here today as the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. With these powerful representatives, these original co-sponsors of this amazing resolution. On behalf of the Poor People's Campaign coordinating committees in 45 states, over 2,000 interfaith clergy, and 300 partner organizations, but especially on behalf of Pamela Garrison, a low-wage worker from West Virginia, daughter of a West Virginian, this nation, that although some say that poverty is a personal failing, that it she was homeless lived in a town where 1,000 of the 16,000 residents were homeless, mainly poor white and indigenous millennials. Mashyla has been organizing with the Poor People's Campaign since our launch more than 3 years ago, and right across from this Capitol, she reminded us. She said, I wasn't homeless because I was stupid and lazy.
That's right.
I was homeless because our country has no problem with pregnant mothers being homeless in the dead of winter. While just 2 hours away in Seattle, the founders of Microsoft and Amazon have made themselves the richest individuals on the planet. You tell me who's messed up in this situation. I'm here hearing the stories, the solutions of Fernando, a leader with the Border Network for Human Rights in El Paso, Texas, who is organizing immigrant communities along the U.S.-Mexico border to end deportation, to end detention, who's called on the demilitarization of our world, of our border, and of our interior, who has proclaimed that we need hugs, not walls, and who wades into the Rio Grande River to reunite families separated by poverty and inequality and unjust immigration policies. I stand here today aware, too aware, of so many people who have died from poverty and inequality in this, as we've heard, the richest country in the world. A nation that has the resources to fully address the curse of poverty. A nation that throws away more food than it takes to feed every person, and yet food lines continue to grow. A nation that has 5 empty housing units for every homeless person and family, and yet evictions continue to rise. With us today, I feel the spirit of Pamela Rush from Lowndes County, Alabama, who had raw sewage in her yard, mold in her trailer, was fighting for health care for all, living wages for all, decent housing and education for all, until she died of COVID and the pre-existing conditions of racism and poverty this year. She inspires me. She inspires the entire Poor People's Campaign to fight on, to build a moral fusion movement, to reconstruct society from the bottom up. Today, we have the solutions to fully address the injustices of systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, militarism, and this false narrative of religious nationalism. We have the solutions. They're right here. They're right here in this third Reconstruction resolution. And so we must build the political will, the compelling power, the resolve to lift from the bottom, so that all of our society, starting with the poor, the bruised, the battered, the marginalized, the excluded, the underpaid, may rise. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. There's an army rising.
Okay, let me, before members have to leave, I'd just like to recognize those members who are here before we go to our next speaker. Congresswoman Jackson-Kowski from the great state of Illinois. Great. Member of Energy and Commerce Committee. Congresswoman Gwen Moore from, of course, Wisconsin, a member of the Ways and Means Committee. Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs, who's going to speak in just a minute from freshman class, and Mr. Brown Rennan from the great state of California. I have Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, who will be speaking in just a minute from Michigan. Yeah. Congressman Danny Davis from the great state of Chicago of Illinois. And Congresswoman Cori Bush will be speaking in just a minute from, again, Mr. Brown Rennan here in the House of Representatives. All right. And let me just say, very briefly, the stories that Reverend Bill Harris and Bishop Barber have raised are so important. We, just in terms of just a bit of background, the stories were told, many at the Budget Committee a couple of years ago. The stories were told at a hearing that we had through the Steering and Policy Committee. The stories have been told and people have been present at the Senate. We had a Senate hearing with Senator Warren, and then on our beloved Elijah Cummings was there. And so there's been were here in Washington, D.C. presented their stories in person before the House of Representatives. So just know, thank you for raising them up, even though they could not be here today. And so now I will ask our sister Congresswoman Cori Bush to come forward. Now, sister Congresswoman Cori Bush is the vice chair. I have the task force, chaired the task force on poverty and opportunity. She's the vice chair of that task force. Comes to Congress with lived experiences, but also is on the Judiciary Committee, ensuring that justice and equality for all becomes real.
Good afternoon, everyone. St. Louis and I thank you. I always start with St. Louis and I because St. Louis has to be to the front of everything that I do. I represent that district. St. Louis and I thank you, Madam Chairwoman Lee, for all that you do and all that you are, and for being such a great mentor, and the Task Force on Poverty and Opportunity, as well as Rev. Jayapal and Reverend Barber and Reverend Theo Harris for inviting me to speak here today. As the Task Force Vice Chair on Children, Families, and Communities, as a formerly unhoused person, as a nurse, I have seen firsthand how poverty continues to devastate communities like where I'm from in St. Louis. Where I'm from, 1 in 6 people currently lives below the poverty line. Where I'm from, 1 in 4 children lives in poverty and is denied the opportunity to live a joyous and a healthy life. It is our responsibility as lawmakers, to develop the thoughtful policies that address both the root causes of poverty and help people heal from the trauma that it inflicts on our communities. We rise together, all of us today, to renew our national call to end poverty in our country once and for all. As a single mother, a single mom of 2, working for $7 an hour, I constantly live with the anxiety of not knowing how I was going to pay for my children's clothes when the school says they have to look like this. Constantly worried about how I would purchase food because we need food to live, and food was not an easy thing to come by, especially if it wasn't sodium filled. And how to pay my rent each and every month. That was an actual thing that after the first, I worried about the next first. I didn't have relief. On the first, after I gave that money, if it hit the first, if it wasn't the 7th or the 17th, I was already worried about what was going to happen the next time I had to pay my rent. Being 1 car accident or 1 flat tire, 1 medical injury away from total catastrophe in my life. The catastrophe that causes chronic stress. It causes chronic stress, that's a real thing, and exhaustion and anguish. I lived in anguish even though I walked with hope. Let me tell you, just because you're low income and marginalized and poor doesn't mean you don't have hope. I had plenty of hope, but I woke up to anguish. Anguish knocked on my door every single day and said, hello, you deserved better. It wasn't that I didn't deserve more, I deserved better, and so do every single regular person in our community. We're making real progress to dismantle systemic economic inequality that is harming our children, harming our families, harming our communities. Our resolution today, it represents a new chapter in congressional response to the plight of those among us who have the least. We have to start with those who have the least. And if we don't, we'll be in the same position we are right now, understanding life over inflicting violence. I urge my colleagues in the House to make the deliberate choice to put the dignity and the needs of our communities above all else. And I thank my colleagues again for their leadership and partnership in this effort. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Representative Bush. We talked earlier about spirit and how when spirits come together, we have no option but to do it. That's right. I mean, that's right. Let me now, and I mentioned our poverty task force, poverty and opportunity task force. I failed to mention it took a while to really, not with these members, but to get our caucus to really focus around low wealth, working families, low wage individuals, poor people, and Congresswoman Jayapal kind of laid that out. But we finally established They heard us. They heard you. They heard the people of this country crying out for a structure in the Congress. So we established the task force on poverty and opportunity. One of our vice chairs now, Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs, is with us. She's a new member. She's hit the ground running, but also she's helping us with her freshman class. She's the leader of the freshman class to get co-sponsors on our resolution.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs, and I'm honored to be here with some of the leading voices in our country speaking out for a more just society. Thank you, Congressman Lee and Congressman Jayapal, for introducing this resolution, and Reverend Barber and Reverend Theo Harris for being here today, and all the work you've done for making the case to end poverty. This resolution is about justice. It's about creating a new approach to government and reimagining the kind of society that we want to have. Before I came to Congress, I founded a nonprofit coalition focused on ending the experience of childhood poverty in San Diego County. I know we've heard a lot of stories today, but let me tell you a little bit about San Diego County. We are one of the wealthiest counties in the country. We have Fortune 500 companies, we have mansions on the beach, and yet we have more than 40% of our kids who are living in families experiencing poverty even before the pandemic. And it isn't just in one pocket or one community or one part. It impacts every single zip code in San Diego County, every single zip code in the United States of America. And that's why the Poor People's Campaign is so necessary and this resolution is so important. Because for too long, we haven't talked about poverty. We haven't centered the voices of those who are experiencing it. Instead, we blamed and punished people experiencing poverty. We put the burden on them to access the services that they're eligible for. We focused on piecemeal approaches that don't actually address the problem, and then when they failed, we blamed the people experiencing poverty themselves. That's right. I'm proud to represent the millennial generation in Congress, a generation that's living through our second economic crisis of our adult lives, and one that knows that we cannot work around the edges any longer. We have to think differently and reimagine a better future. We have to reimagine and rebuild a more just and equitable society, one that invests in our future and builds prosperity from the bottom up. We have to build a safety net that focuses on dignity and empowerment. We know that the problems we're facing are deep, structural, systemic, and interlocking. But what we see in this resolution and in this movement is hope. Because we can't be overwhelmed by these harsh realities. We need to let the depth of this problem compel us to get started, to start working, to start acting. We've heard from a lot of faith leaders. In my faith tradition, we have a saying: do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Love justly now, walk humbly now. You are not obligated to finish the task, but neither are you free to abandon it. And let me say one more thing. While this resolution and this movement very rightly centers the voice of people experiencing poverty, it cannot only be the voice of people experiencing poverty who are calling for change. It is on all of us, especially those of us who have benefited from the system as it is, to push for a fairer and more just America. And I'm so honored to be working with you all on this resolution that shows us the way and shows us how we can make an immediate difference. Thank you.
That's right. Congresswoman Jacobs reminded us that this is really a moral issue. It's value-based, and because of that, we come together and we know that we're going to do this. So thank you, Congresswoman Jacobs, and thank you for your leadership on so many issues. Let me now bring forward my a good friend from Michigan, someone who came to Congress and said she wasn't going to wait anymore on this. She brought the issue of water to the forefront.
That's right.
In our House of Representatives. Yes. She joined my task force, and you don't want me to say what she said to me after a few minutes, like, you don't even want to know, because we talk like that when we say. But Congresswoman, I hope you have hope. There's some talking. You're doing what you said, not just sitting around talking. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much to my mentor. The Congressional Progressive Caucus assigned Congresswoman Barber Lee to me, and I was so incredibly grateful. You probably don't even remember. But we used to meet monthly prior to COVID, and Barber. Thank you. Thank you for bringing your faith forward, but also thank you for continuing this fight, even when it seems very difficult. I'd go into any fight to talk with you by my side, anytime, honestly. And Reverend Barber knows this. He's been to my district several times. But you know, the COVID pandemic, if anything, just exposed just how broken our systems are, how the processes are so broken. And I really, you know, I want to share with you, you know, being a United States Congress member now, and you hear the horror stories of so many of my residents, you know, they were living check by check, and this pandemic had just hit them so hard. But it's when you hear a mother tell me, you know, when am I going to get my child back into early childhood program? And I said, well, I'm going to find you something. Don't worry, I'm going to get you something online. She's like, you don't understand, Rashida. This is where I can get my child fed twice a day. That's just how painful it is on the ground. And so we really have to really bring those voices forward here in Congress. You know, Congresswoman Lee talked about this waiting conflict. It's because our residents, our neighbors have been waiting far too long. You know, everybody here I know wants the same thing. Who doesn't want to end poverty? You know, you know, I'm moving with a sense of urgency. I'm saying time. We don't have another hour. We don't have another day. We don't have another month. And so I'm hoping with this resolution that we can move with that sense of urgency, because really, truly, our residents can't wait. The pain and the generational trauma that we are allowing to continue to happen in our children that are living in poverty, that's going to continue on. And so I just hope that we really, again, move with, again, that sense of urgency. I know my residents are so tired. They're so tired, Rev, of being studied. They're so tired.
That's right. That's right.
How much more do you need to know about me living in poverty? And so, really important as we move forward that we build these alliances. And it's so wonderful to see the diversity of the different districts coming together, because I don't think the brokenness in our society of how we address our most vulnerable has touched every single part of our country. So thank you with that, and God bless you.
Congresswoman Lee, can I just take 1 30-second? I know you got another comment, but I want to say something. Congresswoman Jayapal, before she was a congressperson, was in the planning meeting for the Michigan Poor People's Campaign 3 years ago. Did I say Tlaib? I'm sorry, I'm confused. The son got me. Tlaib, Congresswoman Tlaib. And she was there for the training. What I want folks also to understand is two important people. Now, this resolution will take on those who do something and say, we just move folk out of poverty, because what we're going to ask you is, which measurement did you use? Because if you mean you just got somebody to $12,900 a year, because you know the old poverty line said if you make above $12,800 a year, you're no longer poor. Yeah. We're not dealing with that measurement anymore. That's a false measurement. Secondly, we are in a movement. We did 6 weeks of nonviolent direct civil disobedience in action here in 2018. The resolution is the map, the call for the resolve. We as a movement, I want you to know this, are committed to, we've done enough study. That's why we're telling you, we're coming to DC in 2022. We're organizing around the country, and we're committed. What you do in nonviolent action, you have to make sure first people clearly know what you want, why you want it. And then you have to be willing to do everything, including putting your bodies on the line nonviolently, to shift the narrative and build power. Please understand that this time is now. We're calling for the resolve, and we have the resolve of people all over this country. Like the lady I met in Appalachia 2 weeks ago, and we were with her on Monday constantly, and I asked her what was she doing. She said, we're having Taco Monday. I said, why are you having Taco Monday? She said, every Monday we have Taco Mondays to raise money to provide women who work for less than living wage their supplies for their menstrual cycle. She said, we're tired. And if this movement is serious about mobilizing in every way, legislative, legally, consciously, agitation, all of it in a nonviolent way, then I'm with this movement. I want you to know that's the resolve we have.
Thank you, Bishop Barber. Let me just mention, some say how practical is this? How are we going to get this done? Well, I want you to know, so much of this resolution already members of Congress have introduced in terms of legislation. We're going to ask for executive orders on some of the provisions. the Democratic Party platform. Bishop Barber testified before the platform committee, so many provisions are in the Biden-Harris Democratic Party platform. So just know this is a very realistic document, realistic resolution that not only gives people dignity, but people hope, and we're going to make sure that we get this done legislatively. Now I'd like to ask our colleague from Maryland to come forward, Congressman Jamie Raskin, who is the protector of our democracy, and especially for low-wage people, for poor people, for low-wealth people, for low-income communities. Thank you so much for being part of this. Thank you for being a co-sponsor.
Thank you so much, Martin Lee. I'm saluting you and Congressman Jayapal for the resolution, Reverend Barber, Reverend Theo Harris. Thank you for your extraordinary leadership. I wasn't here, so I don't know what everybody said, so I just want to say two things real quickly. Okay. And well, one is, you know, people sometimes talk to drag pie in the sky way. We 50% with one vote.
Yeah.
This is something that is practical. We can do this. All we need is the political commitment to make it happen. Having said that, it's going to be very serious business, as Reverend Barber says, because it's going to require the only thing that's ever worked in the country to really redistribute power, which is a mass nonviolent movement. And I want to contrast that with what we experienced on January 6th, which was a violent insurrection. And I want to thank these for showing America how you actually make constructive change. You don't knock down the windows and beat up the cops and storm the Capitol.
Soul. Okay, Congresswoman, you called this a conversation, but I think it's the benediction for coming and being witnesses to what we're getting ready to do on Monday. And also, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask members, feel free. We're going to end the press conference now because everyone has obligations that we have over time. But it was important to hear the perspective, and the spirit, and the clarity of purpose of all those here. So thank you, Bishop Barber. Thank you, Reverend Theo Harris, for being here.
And if you all have to go back to the hall, we know Liz and I can take some questions.
Okay.